Hello, and thank you for coming. As a quick introduction, my name is Amy, and I'm a third-year PhD researcher at Nottingham-Trent University, working at the intersection of museum studies and game studies. I thought I'd begin, before we explore how video games might contribute to the work of museum interpretation, by exploring the concept of interpretation itself in a museum context. So, what do we mean when we talk about museum interpretation? Is it different from understanding interpretation more generally, and should it be? Within the context of the museum sector, there are many different definitions of museum interpretation offered by academics and associations alike. Museum interpretation is most commonly defined in terms of a process of communication between the museum institution and visitors. As such, it's generally understood and accepted as the ways in which museums communicate information about their collections to their users, with the aim of imparting or sharing knowledge and meaning, and prompting response. But so far, so interpretation. There are a couple of things that set the initial understanding of museum-specific interpretation apart from the broader definitions, as outlined here. The roots of interpretive theory and interpretive practice can be traced back to the 19th century, when the first museums as we recognise them today began to emerge. In this era of museum work, the mission of the museum was to collect and categorise objects and educate the masses. It was the job of the museum, law states, to transmit information with an emphasis on the authoritative voice of the museum curator and subject experts. To the museum professional, the visitor was assumed to be a blank slate with no prior knowledge, requiring the authoritative voice to explain the relationship between objects and the worlds for them through interpretation. The role of interpretation, therefore, was to convey the museum's intended message. Hind describes this style of interpretive learning as the museum pedagogy, where each visitor is presumed to take away the same single piece of information. Therefore, unlike other forms of interpretation, museum and heritage interpretation was explicitly educational in purpose, and relied upon the authoritative voice to impart information to the ignorant visitor. The origins of current interpretive theory can be traced back to Freeman Tilden, an employee of the US National Park Service, who published Interpreting Our Heritage in 1957. Much of Tilden's work was, in many ways, ahead of its time. Within his 6 principles of interpretation, Tilden highlighted a number of key elements to the interpretive process, which would later be theorized by academics in museum studies. For example, Tilden recognized in his first principle that interpretation works best when the visitor can relate what is being displayed to their own experience. To quote, "Any interpretation that does not somehow relate what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or experience of the visitor will be sterile." Furthermore, within his 4th principle, he noted that interpretation should aim to provoke, rather than simply instruct or inform. Yet, at the same time, there are issues with Tilden's work. While some of his writing suggests an improved understanding of the visitor as involved in the interpretive process, an emphasis remains on the idea that the interpretation presented should be whole, in essence unchallengeable, and based upon an authoritative source. Russell Staife provides a particularly useful critique of Tilden's principles, and one of the main points he draws upon is Tilden's understanding of where meaning is derived. Staife argues that meaning does not lie hidden, as Tilden suggests, within the objects themselves, which must then be revealed by those capable of reading the signs, in this case interpreters, but rather that meaning arises from the ways in which we each individually create different representations of these objects. Staife's observations on Tilden reflect a shift that has been ongoing in museum interpretation studies, built upon the incorporation of new theories and ideas, and upon a growing interest in visitor studies. As such, our understanding of the role of the visitor in the interpretive process has changed, and practice has moved to match. In particular, the idea of meaning-making, as first laid out for museum studies by Silverman, has been especially influential. In Silverman's breakdown, interpretation becomes a conversation or a dialogue, where the visitor is recognized as an active and valued participant in the process of determining the meaning of a given object. In terms of interpretation as explicitly educational, new theories have also shifted focus from object to visitor. For example, in Huber-Greenhill's analysis of interpretation, she draws upon the constructivist theory of learning, within which learning is recognised as both personal and individual, and social. Falk and Dierking's work establishes similar ideas, namely that learning is contextual and recognises that the learner engages in a cognitive and emotional process, not only coming to the museum with a personal context constructed of previous knowledge, experience and interests, but that what and how they choose to learn will be influenced by that context. Underlying all these changes has been an acceptance of new theories, in particular cognitive theory, which help us understand how individual people take in and unwrap information based upon their own unique prior knowledge and experience. The problem, so to speak, is that interpretation theory hasn't really changed much since Tilden's work. Indeed, many later writings, including Hondsmerk, which I quoted on the first slide, are based upon the principles laid out in Interpreting Our Heritage. But there have been changes in society, theory and technology for which Tilden's work cannot account. Interpretation theory, therefore, has been identified as being in need of reconceptualization, in particular in relation to the emergence of new digital technologies and a multimedia society. The most obvious of which, and the most relevant to this research, is the rise of the internet and digital games. As Rahaman notes, amongst the other problems with Tilden's work is the fact that Tilden's writings were not designed for a digital world. As such, in theory, and in many ways in practice, museum interpretation is not fully utilising the affordances of the digital age. Additionally, one interesting observation from Staife was his surprise at the ease with which his younger relatives utilised the internet to augment their museum visits on their phones and their tablets. They were looking up extra information, sharing pictures and asking questions. Whether the museum intended it or not, his relatives were engaging in their own process of interpretation, both inside and outside of the museum building. In a world where we are bombarded on all sides by ever more easy-to-access information, Staife came to the conclusion that what museums needed was not to provide ever more labels and panels of interpretive information, but instead they needed to find ways to incorporate what people were already doing into their exhibitions, to include multimedia aspects to adapt to a digital world. In essence, museums needed to be interpretation-rich rather than interpretation-heavy. Allow me to briefly provide some examples of what I mean here and introduce you to the Tank Story exhibition at the Tank Museum in Bovington. My husband and I went to this exhibition last year, and I, as someone who likes to read everything in museums, and he, a tank enthusiast, got to the end of this first row that you can see here and promptly gave up on reading anything. The entire room was full of interpretive tools, films, pictures, information panels galore. The problem was there was simply too much interpretation, too much to read, and no way to give back our own impressions, and museum and reading fatigue hit us both hard and quickly. In contrast, the recent Constraint and Restraint exhibition at the National Justice Museum is what I would describe as interpretation-rich, and I highly recommend you explore the virtual exhibition on their website. The exhibition itself is label-light, and there are several places where visitors are given space to contribute their own thoughts on the themes and objects displayed. The exhibition handbook itself contains information from the project lab, to which visitors to the museum were active contributors throughout the process of developing the exhibition. So, I just thought we'd quickly summarise where we stand on interpretation in museums before we move to look at video games. There are elements of current interpretive theory to take forward, some old theory to challenge, and a couple of areas identified where digital tools in particular are perhaps especially suited to interpretive work in modern museums. This is all well and good, but what does it have to do with video games? Video games, I believe, have a lot to offer museums. For one, the video game industry has become one of the largest industries of the digital age, and equally one of the most varied. Furthermore, and in response to one of the key difficulties of museum interpretation, video games are in their very nature participatory. They cannot progress without input from the player. The growing interest in video games in the museum sector has also broadly reflected a changing attitude towards play. As an offshoot of sort is the changing understanding of visitors and how they interact with and learn from exhibitions. In recent years, museums have opened up considerably to the idea of play and play in museums as part of the museum experience. Initiatives such as the Happy Museum project, from which the Rules for a Playful Museum from Manchester Museum emerged, have garnered considerable interest. That's not to say that play is a new concept in museums. Indeed, Andrea Whitcomb notes that interactors are the focus of play have been prevalent as far back as the late 1980s. But over the last decade, museum and heritage sites have undertaken new projects which aim to bring playfulness back into the museum, including the co-production initiative, which results in exhibitions like the Constraint and Restraint exhibition at the National Justice Museum. And finally, and particularly relevant in the current pandemic where many museums have had to close their doors, unlike other forms of interpretive outreach, video games come with an existing and often enthusiastic player base, which can allow the museum to reach visitors they wouldn't otherwise. And indeed, one such game project at the Wellcome Collection, High Tea, resulted in a large number of players interacting with the museum who otherwise wouldn't have. Video games themselves are hardly a new development in museums. In fact, museums have been utilising video games as a medium for some time, often as a way to engage the interest of younger audiences and to take advantage of the subgenre as serious games, with the aim of using them as teaching tools. However, my research is interested in how video games could be used as interpretive tools to facilitate that kind of interpretive dialogue we've previously discussed. To this end, alongside the more general contributions that video games as a medium have to offer, I have been focusing on 3 specific areas within game design and game mechanics that also have counterparts in interpretive theory and understanding, some of which we'll explore through the case studies, to examine how affordances of the medium can address challenges and fulfil needs in contemporary museum interpretive practice. And I've highlighted some of the key crossovers I've identified for you briefly here. Turning then to some case studies. These museum projects reflect not only a growing interest in video games in the museum sector, but also the ways in which museums are already beginning to explore the affordances of the medium, with a focus on how these affordances allow the games to work as interpretive tools. And in this brief overview, I hope to raise some ideas and issues for consideration moving forward. So, let us turn to a project which was started in 2015. Created in collaboration between the Cambridge Forge Museum in Spalding and the University of Lincoln, the VR Blacksmith comprises of a couple of game and technological elements. The virtual reality experience itself, as seen here, is a recreation of a blacksmith's forge, within which players can have a go at working the forge and creating something using blacksmithery techniques. Particularly interesting is that the game is designed so that the object created in the virtual world can be 3D printed, bringing the player's creation into the real world. The VR Blacksmith is also especially of interest as an example of intangible heritage, that is, heritage beyond buildings and collections that make up important elements of cultural history, including skills and traditions. Indeed, ensuring the survival of a struggling tradition was one of the goals of the projects, and here I'll let the project leads speak for themselves.
At Cambridge Forge in Spalding, one of the world's oldest crafts is alive and well. Here, blacksmiths with a lifetime of experience bend, shape and weld hot metal. But as those who have the skill and knowledge get older, a new generation needs to enter the trade. And that's where the latest virtual reality technology comes in.
So if you look on the floor to your left, you should see a bucket of coal. If you pick that up, you can pour that coal onto the pile.
At the University of Lincoln, they've built a virtual blacksmith's forge.
We can get younger people more interested in history, heritage, but through a modern technology way that they understand.
Users can experience the basic principles behind blacksmithing, and the hope is that young people may go on to take it up for real. The Heritage Craft Alliance says there's a shortage of workers trained in traditional skills, and that this sort of technology could help.
The VR Blacksmith project contains a number of elements of interest when considering how museums undertake interpretation, especially of intangible heritage. How to preserve and exhibit intangible heritage remains a problem in the museum sector, especially when there are no physical objects to build an interpretive tool upon. The potential of video games as a way to capture and display intangible heritage, especially in virtual reality, has only just begun to be explored. In the case of the VR Blacksmith, the game allows visitors not just to understand the process of blacksmithing, but also to have a go at it themselves within a safe environment, away from the hazards of a working forge. The experience goes beyond the intellectual, requiring players to use their whole bodies to interact with heritage, to touch, manipulate and interact, and, under the guidance of a real blacksmith, to learn a skill. Through the experience, The players are also given the chance to challenge their own preconceptions about blacksmithery as a process by exploring for themselves in a playful manner what does and doesn't work, failing safely and achieving progress within the virtual environment. The addition of the 3D printing option for objects created in the virtual experience also allows players to have a tangible memento of their experience, a physical object from which the interpretive process can continue beyond the virtual reality game itself, by allowing visitors to share and explore the different creations of other players and how they were created. As the goal of the project is to encourage young people to take up the blacksmith skill, it's also possible to see how this experience draws upon some of the affordances of games for procedural rhetoric, that is, the building and deconstructing of arguments through game mechanics, by prompting players to critically consider their existing interpretations, opinions and knowledge of blacksmithery, and whether or not they would consider taking it up in real life. Another example of a different way in which games have been explored in the museums and heritage sector is the Word by Word app developed in 2018. Undertaken as part of a research project by the University of Copenhagen in collaboration with the National Gallery of Denmark, the goals of this game are more explicitly interpretively charged. Indeed, as seen in a research paper about the project leads identify the desire to encourage visitors to undertake the interpretive process as part of the motivation behind the research. The app itself is based upon a fairly simple storytelling concept. Two players would work together to build a short 11-sentence story, combining their words with images of artworks in the gallery. The app would provide an artwork from the gallery with a prompt or first line to start, from which visitors would construct a story by exploring the museum to find artworks that inspired them, photographing them, and adding them to the story with the sentence. Visitors, therefore, would undertake an interpretive act, defining the personal meaning of the artwork for them in their individual context, through the process of constructing their story. The social aspects of the app came in the form of the collaborative nature of the storytelling, with the ability to add an artwork and story element switching between the two players throughout the process, and through the ability to share their completed story with others in the Hall of Stories. This Hall of Stories also provided players with the ability to interact with other people's interpretations, facilitating the process of dialogue, and helping visitors to develop their own understandings by building upon knowledge and experience shared by others. Outside of the explicit interpretive systems and goals, the Word by Word app also provides some valuable insights into how the various elements of game design and game mechanic choices can contribute towards creating a highly effective interpretive tool. The research paper on the project highlights the importance of the app as a participatory one, in which the visitor becomes the content creator, almost fulfilling the role of the museum curator. Indeed, whilst the information provided by the gallery about the artwork is available, within the app, it is the visitor who is the author of meaning. Equally, the ability to share stories, and indeed the collaborative nature of the game, encourages visitors to consider the artwork from multiple narratives and perspectives, the museum's, their own, and the perspective of other visitors. In this way, the app prompts its players to consider the objects with an interpretive depth that may not be possible from a label or linear narrative alone. Furthermore, the inclusion and availability of other perspectives also encourages visitors to engage critically with different interpretations, even those that they may not agree with, in order to reach a fuller personal understanding of the artworks. Finally, outside of the emotional and affective responses arising from the process of interpretation and learning itself, the app encourages visitors to engage with the emotional power of the artwork, and to share these responses not only through their stories, but through the ability to add emoji reactions to other stories, further moving the museum away from the strict and academic reputation of its past, from which the traditional understanding of interpretation developed. I hope this presentation has provoked some ideas about the intersection of museums and video games. I suspect there's a whole other talk's worth of developments arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ways games and museums have interacted during lockdown. Personally, going forward with my research, I intend to continue exploring the ways the museums utilise games, and how games are being and can be used for interpretation, hopefully culminating in the creation of a game for a museum based upon my findings. And finally, thank you for listening. The full list of references is available via the QR code, and if you do have any questions, my contact details are there on the right. I look forward to talking to you all in Discord. Thanks again, and see you there.